Welcome to the Plunge with Derek Holzer. Sunshine Derek here today because it is almost summertime. I know for most of the country you're experiencing summer weather. Here up in the upper left corner of the United States, we've gotten a taste of it and we know it's just around the corner. So I don't know about you, but when the sun comes out, I get up. I'm ready to go. How about you? Anyway, joining me today is a fabulous guest and a new friend, and hopefully a longtime friend for years to come, Amanda B. Vernon. Amanda is a writer, teacher, and academic working at the intersection of 19th century literature and theology. She is a teaching fellow at the University of Tübingen in Germany and an honorary junior fellow of the University of Buckingham in the UK. Her work has been published in Victorian Review and Victorians. She is co-editor with Daniel Gableman of Unsaying the Commonplace, George MacDonald and the Critique of Victorian Convention. She is currently writing her first monograph, Reading with the Trinity, Theology and Literary Form in George MacDonald. You can find her at www. Does anybody say that anymore? You don't need to say the www anymore. That's how old I am. I might even say the http://. Anyway, you can find Amanda at amandabvernon.com. AMANDAB, the B stands for best, VERNON.com. AmandaBvernon.com. Amanda and I discuss the young adulthood, transition, and vocation as she interacts with students and is herself recently graduated from her academic studies. We talk about a number of things, but in particular, how young people today are encountering what she is calling the beginning of the post-critical era. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Amanda. I know I did. She is winsome, she is jolly, she is hopeful, and she is quite learned. So I think you'll be blessed as I was. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Amanda for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. All right, Amanda Vernon, it's so good to see you.
Oh, it's great to see you. Thank you for having me to have a chat about George MacDonald.
Of course. Well, I was so pleased to make your acquaintance at a conference we attended in Connecticut in December of 2024, and I heard you share at an opening remarks, keynote address, I'm not sure what it was called, but yourself and Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson were sharing on the genius of George MacDonald. But you in particular made a couple of remarks that just, I said, I've got to get Amanda to come on the plunge to explore this further. And so before we dive into kind of what prompted me to ask you to join us, would you be willing to share a little bit about your own backstory and how you grew up, where you came from, and what you're doing now?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. And yeah, thank you for that. So I'm originally from Ohio, from Cleveland, but I've been living abroad for a while. I moved to the UK in 2012 to do studying and kind of ended up staying. And that's where I call home, but I'm actually living in Germany this year. So I'm doing a fellowship at the University of Tübingen doing teaching and research. So I am based in Europe now, having my fill of pretzels and, all sorts of good German baking.
You have a nice hearty Stein available to...
I should get one. Yeah. I haven't yet invested in one, but I've been sampling the beer.
Good.
So, So I've been, so I'm in academia. That's the short answer. So I kind of did undergrad, master's in literature, in the UK, a diploma in theology, and then a PhD in literature. So I kind of work at the intersection of literature and 19th century literature and theology.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Was there anything in your childhood or adolescence that prompted this? Was it always a part of who you were?
Yeah, I'm kind of a classic bookworm. So some of my fondest childhood memories are of being curled up somewhere reading and going to the library and getting a stack of books. So yeah, so that's, I think I was always kind of drawn to books, and that was a very natural thing. I don't think anyone who knew me as a child would be surprised to know that I'm teaching and researching literature now. So yeah, so that's been always there. And then I think I grew up in a Christian family, so I've been surrounded by that. And then I think I probably started getting more interested in theology in my undergraduate. And so found myself gravitating towards those kinds of topics when I was doing my essays and things like that. So.
Interesting. Is there any particular stories that really stood out or were pivotal in your quest?
Oh man, you mean when I was younger, when I
Yes,
was
yes.
a kid? There's so many. I think one of the ones that I reread the most, and this is the one that I kind of attribute to having a significant impact on my imagination, was A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett.
Oh,
So I loved that book, and I think it was Sarah Cruz. Just the she kind of existed in her imagination, and the way that it kind of shaped her reality and helped her survive really difficult circumstances, that I found that very appealing. And I think that kind of shaped the way that I was existing in my childhood, just kind of living in this imaginative world as well. So I think that one I'm very fond of that one
yeah.
still.
So,
Yeah.
so you were the type of child that would be just fully immersed in your stories as you're reading, kind of forget that the
Yes.
world around you was even there.
Yes. I think my mother can attest to that. Trying to get my attention when I was reading. But
That's
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah, yeah.
Can I ask how you found your way to particularly nineteenth century literature?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just something that I naturally gravitated towards. So I tried to read probably too early a lot of the 19th century novels when I was a kid. I remember reading Dickens and stuff when I was young, and I got it, to some extent. But when I go back now, I think, oh, I had no idea. But I think I just had a taste for something about the world that I was reading about, and so when I got to my master's, I specialized in Victorian. My master's is in English literature and specifically Victorian study. So it just seemed, again, I didn't really think too much about it. I just knew that that's what I was interested in. So, and I continue to be very interested in that. So I guess it's good that I went with my instinct on that.
That's great. Well, you're a perfect fit for what we're trying to produce here with the Plunge, with having your passion for literature, but also theology. And I think it could be argued that the best theology is told as a story, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're not going to hear any protests from me about that.
Well, I mean, the challenge, and we're going to speak to this a little bit today, because as I've kind of titled your section of the George MacDonald for Every Generation series, sort of vocation in transition. As you work with students yourself, as you remarked in your talk about sort of the post-critical period that we are now experiencing, I think about how so much of theology, at least in my experience, was a bit reductionist
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and quite just rules essentially without embodiment. And
yeah.
I assume that's your experience as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that has drawn me to McDonald, is that not just a kind of defensive, it's okay to have a more fleshed out theology in terms of narrative or different kinds of imagery and metaphors and stuff, but actually the necessity of that for our kind of spiritual well-being and our way of connecting with God and so on. So I think, yeah, I concur, and I think that is probably one of the reasons that I like McDonald so much.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about George, shall we?
Sure, yeah, great.
So I found this book. I don't know if
Uh,
I don't know if you're familiar with it,
that
but
looks familiar. Spent a lot of time agonizing over the colors of the cover.
well, they are distinctive. I can tell you that.
Good, good.
I don't know of any other combination of lavender, fuchsia, cream. It's very nice.
I feel like yeah, yeah. I like the colors too.
Yeah.
We did spend a lot of time on that.
Well, I understand that, and I appreciate it very much. My point was, I got this copy here of this book entitled "Unsaying the Commonplace: George MacDonald and the Critique of Victorian Convention," and you and your colleague co-edited this. How do you say his name?
Daniel Gableman.
Gableman. I didn't want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
mispronounce his last name, but
yeah.
so you created this. But I read this review from a professor, Roderick. Let's see if I can get this name right, McGillis,
Yep.
and
Perfect.
he says this is the best book of essays we have on MacDonald, exceeding several that have preceded it. This book is indispensable. So, Amanda, wow. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
what?
yeah.
Why is he right? And those people who are watching this series, why should they get this? And what's a key takeaway from this work?
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, I say wow too. It's quite a review. It's very gratifying. Um, so yeah, lots. I mean, the first thing to say is it's an edited collection, so it has a lot of contributors to it. So it's Danny and I each have a chapter in it, and we wrote the introduction, and we edited and worked with the authors. But it's definitely a group project. That's the first thing to say. A key takeaway. I mean, I guess there are a couple, maybe if I can have two key takeaways.
The floor is yours.
Um, the first is, I think, so Danny Gibelman, who I co-edited with, we wanted to kind of move things forward a bit in McDonald studies. But I should say also the book isn't just for academics. It's written very accessibly. I think each of our writers does a fantastic job of writing very clearly and accessibly. But it's a scholarly book as well. And I think because work on McDonald is not yet mainstream, there's been a tendency to kind of produce work that feels a bit like variations on a theme. So kind of a lot of the same issues rehashed, similar ground gone over, and so on. And so as we write in the introduction, the essays in this book are kind of an attempt to push into new areas of MacDonald's work and life, and to reconsider aspects of his work that might need to be revisited, like his relationship with science. So there are these great riches in his work and in his thought, and there's so much potential for more work on him. And so Danny and I kind of wanted this to take things forward in terms of the different areas that people could consider, and in terms of the quality of the work. So it's accessible, but also some kind of fresh scholarship. So I think that might be part of where the review is coming from, is that we kind of hope to move things in a new direction, as a kind of invitation for other people to do their own, thinking about things. So I guess that would be one reason to look at it. I think the second thing is, I wonder if it might be helpful for your listeners to get a sense of what they would be reading if they pick up a copy of the book. This title, Unsaying the Commonplace, is maybe a little bit weird.
Right.
Very niche. So I'm not sure if it's particularly clear. I think, again, Danny and I kind of batted around different titles for a while. I think Unspeaking was put on the table, and I thought, oh no, it sounds like Unspeakable, and that feels negative. So we ended up with Unsaying. And we landed on this title because we thought that it captured a kind of the thread of an idea that runs through all the essays in the collection, this kind of unifying idea, and also the manner in which MacDonald was undertaking his cultural and literary and theological critique. So these are the three sections of the book. We have MacDonald and culture, MacDonald and literature, and MacDonald and theology. So we discuss in the introduction what we mean by both unsaying and the commonplace, but kind of summarized, the commonplace is a term that MacDonald uses a lot in his work. So what he means by this is essentially anything that's opposed to imagination, to wonder, creativity, the spiritual. So things like conventionality, materialism, selfishness, worldliness, that kind of thing. So those are the kind of commonplace things. And it's important to note this doesn't have to do with any class in any way, or
Right.
kind of the ordinary things. So it's, he's not being a snob or something like that. He's kind of all about the ordinary. Every loaf of bread and every glass of wine kind of has this potential to be a symbol of, the Eucharist, or, for MacDonald. So everything is the ordinary is very good for him. But the commonplace is a kind of distortion of something good. So there's an element of falseness in it. Um,
Sorry,
and this,
you
yeah.
mean labeling it commonplace? Is that what you
So
mean? Or
the way that he uses that term. So I guess
yeah,
I'm trying to make a distinction between the ordinary, which is a good thing,
okay,
um, which is just like everyday life, sitting at your kitchen, having a meal with your family or your friends or whatever, versus the commonplace, which is this kind of uh, these negative things for MacDonald, this worldliness or
I
um,
see.
this kind of convention, the way things are done in our particular cultural moment in society. So he sees this as kind of, he calls it the great dragon in one of his books that needs to be slain. Um, and the way that he approaches this, the way that he kind of attempts to slay this dragon is not through direct critique. Usually, he does
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, but he kind of takes a more oblique approach. So he does it by attempting to kind of cultivate imagination in his reader. So he offers us a kind of imaginative vision that is more appealing than the commonplace that we're surrounded by, that kind of wakes something up in us that kind of challenges us and our ways of looking at the world, a kind of conventional way of looking at the world, maybe that enchants us. And so this is kind of his approach as a critic, as a literary critic, as a theologian, so on. He kind of operates on this principle of the highest role of the critic being to draw attention to the good rather than paying so much attention to and kind of tearing down the bad. He kind of had this idea that the bad would die of itself. It doesn't have any life in and of itself.
Right.
It kind of is, it's a parasite on the good in a way. Yeah. So I don't know. So that's kind of like the two terms, and unsaying is a kind of is how we're sort of referring to that mode of dealing with this commonplace idea. So the kind of recognition of the fact that um, language is complex, and the statements that we make, particularly statements about God, we can make a statement, but sometimes then we have to unsay that because we learn something else, or
Mm.
there's a constant need for adjustment in the statements that we make, especially the kind of theological statements that we make. And so there's this constant movement and constant dynamic when we talk about reality, the kind of ultimate reality. So that's kind of, that gives a little bit of a sense
Yeah.
of how he might be approaching some of these kind of conventional ways of thinking in the Victorian period, and hence the kind of wacky title.
That makes a lot of sense. I really
Yeah,
appreciate you
yeah.
explaining that. Now, you mentioned that in this work, there is perhaps some alternate or, I guess, expanded dimensionality to potential McDonald research study.
Mm, hmm.
Even I call it evangelism. I don't, that word is probably pretty tainted, but I feel as though in my own life, McDonald's work, McDonald's thought has been so instrumental
Mm,
to my spiritual formation, really reformation, and thus my cultural, personal, communal engagement. And so as a consequence, I'm rather passionate to promote McDonald.
yeah.
And I'm curious, in particular, this was not part of what we had sort of outlined before this
Hmm.
conversation. So if you're not inclined to answer, just
Okay.
disregard. But I do foresee or perceive sort of in talks with people like Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson, another friend of mine, Ron Dart, who is
Hmm.
now retired, Michael Phillips, these folks who were sort of digging deep to pull McDonald almost, out of the graveyard with
Yeah, yeah,
respect to notoriety, publication, all these things.
absolutely. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I really perceive, Amanda, that you're part of what I would call the next generation.
Mm.
Not necessarily, I know that your work is much broader than McDonald, but I'm just curious, what are aspects that you could see being cultivated in the decades to come for people who are
Mm.
listening, who are curious, and might want to, go down these paths?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Well, I mean, my my initial answer is kind of biased because I did my PhD looking at MacDonald. MacDonald is a literary critic, which many folks don't know. That was kind of his, alongside his writing, that was how he was supporting his family. And yeah, he was respected. He taught, in all sorts of contexts. He did these lecture tours and so on. So the more I kind of get to grips with that and continue to, work on that, because I'm now working on a book based on my PhD, the more I think, oh, there's so much here. So anyone, who's interested in literature, for instance, or interested in the kind of history of the discipline of literary criticism and how certain texts have been interpreted over the years and so on, or what MacDonald might have to offer us. I think that's huge. That kind of opens up because there's so many different authors that he was writing about. So that's one avenue to pursue. There's some really good work on his theology, but it's so interesting. It's so interesting and unusual. And the more I go back again and reread, the more I think this is remarkable. So I think I would love to let some more theologians loose on his his work, and kind of dig into some of the other aspects of his theology that we haven't focused on so much. We looked a lot at, the theology of childlikeness and imagination and these kinds of things, which is great, but there's so much more there. And then I think something else that's fascinating is his relationship to his kind of contemporary network. So he was so involved with different social reformers and artistic groups and movements. And again, as the more I kind of dive into this stuff, the more I realize how much of a kind of behind the scenes impact he had on a lot of that work, and almost like a kind of, influence on like a personal level as well, but also, people reading his books and things. So, that would be, again, fascinating to go and, dig out some stuff out of archives and find more material on that. So,
that prompts in me the spirit of hospitality that he and his family embodied.
Yes,
we are so ripe for that in our culture.
Yeah,
and I'm hopeful that Kirsten will join us for this series to talk about community.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, she's the best person to talk about
exactly.
that.
Like, for those of you who don't know, if you go to Windstone Farms, the website, Lynn Lawson, the work, Kirsten lives in this manner. And so anyway, it's very inspiring. That's for sure. Okay. How did you first discover George MacDonald?
In my childhood bookworm wanderings.
You're lucky.
So,
I never even heard of him until...
Really? Nothing. When did you... No, I know this is not my interview, but how did you find out about MacDonald?
Of course, C.S. Lewis.
Okay, yes.
And I was in my 30s, maybe my 20s. I can't remember, but yeah, it was well along post-college, and I came across a quote or two about MacDonald as, the person the writer most close to the Spirit of Christ. Just extraordinary praise. And I'm like, who? Right? So that led me, and I've shared this before, but briefly, I picked up a couple of the fairy tales, and I was probably still, I grew up as I was academically decent, but I was an athlete. So sports, and for whatever reason, my mind wasn't mature enough to really see the deeper meaning of what he was putting out there. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't until my early 40s now, about 10 years ago, 10 years ago, that I picked up a copy of his unspoken sermons and was undone and have since, explored and discovered how beautiful all of his work is. So that was my story.
Yeah.
What's your story, Amanda?
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I had this really vivid, my mother, I don't know, she just, she had books around, which was lovely. So I always had interesting things to read, and she had several MacDonald fairy tale books. So I remember, I think she might have read The Princess and the Goblin to us at one point, or I read it. I think she read it though, because I have this vague memory of being terrified of the creatures, the goblin's creatures. So I can kind of I can remember how I imagined that when I was little. It kind of seared itself onto my memory. So I did read MacDonald when I was little, and then I kind of didn't think about him for years. And in my undergraduate, the last year of my undergraduate, I was writing my dissertation and was working on Alice in Wonderland, and got this book out of the library with...
Can you see
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry,
Yes,
go
I'll
ahead.
ask you about that later. Yeah, so I got Stephen Prickett's book on Victorian fantasy out of the library, and I saw a chapter on MacDonald, and I went, "Oh yeah, George MacDonald. I forgot about him. I'll just have a look at this." And then it kind of sparked this memory, and I thought, "Oh, I want to read some MacDonald." So I ordered The Princess and the Goblin, and yeah, it kind of came at just the right time, and I started reading him more, and just yeah, kind of ended up working on him in my master's and reading him, so I was working on him, but he's, I love him,
Yeah.
personally as well. It's not
Yes.
just a kind of topic of study. Yeah, that's how I refound him.
He's a dear friend.
He is a dear friend. Yeah. Yeah, my housemate when I was working on my my PhD was she joked we should get a picture and put him up on the wall because he's so present in our in our apartment with me sitting there working on my PhD. She's like, I feel like he's our third housemate because I'd always be like, oh, George MacDonald said this, and
Yes. Yeah.
so yeah, yeah. But
That's beautiful.
hmm.
Would you articulate why you think he's so meaningful to our world?
Well,
Just an easy question.
I'm gonna I'm gonna pull a George MacDonald on you, and one of the things I like about him is and especially in his essay on the fantastic imagination, is how he talks about fairy tales speaking to each person in a different way and
Hmm.
awakening meanings in them in different ways. So I think it depends. I think each person, can find something different and meaningful in McDonald. So maybe I'll tell you what I find meaningful, and maybe that will resonate with somebody. But I think his idea. So one of the ideas that I was interested in during my PhD was his insistence, not just on the validity, but the absolute necessity of creating these kind of new forms, as he would say. So
Hmm.
new language, metaphors and images and narratives and stories to capture something of the Christian story, and to put things into fresh theological language. So I know we mentioned this something like this a minute ago, but that I found that so appealing, and I do find that so appealing. And he was kind of similarly insistent that every person has a particular experience of God and therefore has something to share with others. And not every person, is going to be Tennyson or Wordsworth in their ability to write poetry about it, but we all have this kind of poetic imagination. We all have this experience of God, and we can, learn from one another. Um, and as someone who is a bit allergic sometimes to religious language, I think, me, um, sometimes I think, the words that we insist on using carry these overtones that we might not be aware of, and that I think can be alienating to people. And so I find it very freeing. It was very freeing for me to find in MacDonald someone who kind of wrote, well, if a word isn't working, then don't use it. Find a new way of saying it. And someone who, seemed to recognize the complexity of language and the kind of
Mm.
organic nature, how it develops and changes, and the limitations of language, and when we're talking about God, but not seeing that as a problem, seeing it as an opportunity to, oh, we get to create new ways of thinking, articulating this and thinking about this, and that's a means of us actually using that creativity to connect, and to kind of connect in our faith rather than it being a problem. So, as somebody who writes and who loves language and literature and loves to find these kinds of ideas in different literary texts, the ways that people articulate their own experience of faith or their own wrestling with faith and doubt or whatever it might be, that fascinates me. And so, yeah, I loved that MacDonald kind of put that into words in a way that I, was very excited about when I first encountered that. So I like that about him.
That's really good. Yeah, again, this openness that he carries with
Yes.
respect to each person's. I think of his unspoken sermon about the white stone with our
Yes.
unique name, but
Yeah.
also his willingness to not be stuck with various formalities or constraints, limits that would preclude anyone from accessing
Hmm.
the heart of the Father, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
yeah, again, his hospitality is so evident.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so we're talking about vocation, transition in particular.
Hmm.
Eventually, we'll get there. Um, And one of the reasons that I wanted you to join us is because you're currently participating as a professor in the academy. And as a consequence of that, I feel like, when I am actively teaching at the college level, I've been on hiatus for a couple of years, but you have a unique perspective, what I call a front row seat to cultural trends that, at least for someone my age, is off the radar. I've got patterns and habits that prevent me really from engaging, and probably it's best that I don't engage in whatever it is that 20-somethings are into. But I would look very awkward. But I'm curious.
Doing the TikTok dances.
Yeah, no, not going to happen. But I'm curious about what challenges and opportunities you perceive as you're a participant and a spectator to these dynamics.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to some extent, I'm mostly a spectator as well, because I'm the old person at the front of the classroom, So, which is what I found. I didn't think I was particularly young and hip, but I found I'm definitely not, certainly not down with the kids. Anyway, and I use that expression now, so definitely not down with the kids.
Yeah, you're
But
hip.
anyway, something that I've noticed that from what I can tell, there seems to be, I think, a desire amongst young people, a kind of broad desire for a bit more stability and a bit more structure, interestingly. And I've noticed this in Christian circles, that it often kind of manifests itself in a return to more traditional liturgical forms of worship sometimes. That seems to be a real movement in my mind. In terms of a broader context, though, I think we might be seeing this. What we're seeing politically seems to be indicative of this desire for kind of clarity and stability, with young people kind of moving to extreme positions on both sides, I think. And that presents a challenge, obviously, because that can lead sometimes to following the louder voices, and not thinking too much about where we're headed. But at the same time, I think there's definitely an opportunity. I think one thing I have noticed, which I think is, to some extent almost like goes along with this, and that I've been very struck by in relation to my students, is the kind of rejection of cynicism and extreme skepticism. So I don't think that they're extremely skeptical. I think they're kind of tired of that. And so I sometimes do this exercise in my seminars where I give students like 6 or 7 quotations from different articles or academic books about a text that we're looking at, giving different interpretations. So for instance, this year, the semester just gone, I did Christmas Carol. So we did this in the class where I was teaching that. And I make sure to include some interpretations that are a little bit more on this kind of suspicious side. So they're often kind of pointing out moments of complicity between the text or the author and more like problematic political or ideological structures, which sometimes can bring out really helpful things and open up really, really fruitful conversations, and then sometimes can go maybe a bit too far and read a bit too much into the text. So, there's a balance with these things. But so I have my students kind of rank these extracts from most convincing to least convincing, and then say why. And they always put these suspicious readings at lowest, as the bottom of the pile. And I'm so fascinated by this because they're often more nuanced. My students are more nuanced in their readings of the literary text, and kind of willing to get closer to it, not kind of standing at a distance and analyzing it, but really getting into it. And so, yeah, I find that really interesting. And in my mind, I kind of am connecting this with what you mentioned earlier, this the keynote that I gave with Kirsten in December, this post-critical movement. To me, this seems to be connected because, so just for those who aren't aware of this movement, it's this movement in literary studies. I know it best in literary studies, also in philosophy, other areas of the academy, that's kind of informed and motivated by a desire to move beyond this sort of overly suspicious mode of critique that is not really serving us any longer. The people who are kind of in this movement claim this. So there's a kind of recognition that we need to be doing more than just pulling things apart. There's a need for a kind of creative element to it as well, something that kind of positive, I guess how I would phrase it at the end. And I think one of and this applies to more than just reading literature. I think this kind of applies more broadly. So one of the ideas that I think really resonates is that we're not just in need of different ways of thinking, but we're in need of an alternative ethos or mood or disposition. And that phrase comes from an introduction to a collection by two academics, Rita Felski and Elizabeth Anker. And so this alternative disposition isn't, as I said, just related to reading literature. I think it also applies to how we, for instance, engage, the manner in which we engage people in conversation. So Felski and Anker also talk about being committed to treating texts with respect and care and attention, and emphasizing the visible rather than the concealed, more in a spirit of dialogue and constructiveness rather than dissection and diagnosis. So there's a kind of more of an open spirit in this. And that might be ringing a few bells from a few minutes ago when I talked about McDonald's approach to critique. Because there are a lot of resonances there between his work, actually, and some of these newer ideas that are present in this movement. So for him, the role of a critic is one of service. So he thinks that, it can be accomplished better by showing truth than exposing error, by unveiling beauty than by this kind of critical dissection of deformity. So you've got that language again, the dissection language. And he also talks about books as needing to be approached with generosity, kind of as living things to see what they reveal to us. And underlying all of this is critical thinking for all of these people. It's not like, we're just going to throw our brains out the window. So there's still the need to think critically about things, but to kind of have a better balance. I mean, I think there's something important that's being picked up on here. It's not always about diagnosing kind of the problem and solution. We also need to pay attention to the manner in which we are dialoguing and reading and writing in various ways, whether it's like reading social media or text messages or whatever, or books. And the reason that I go into all that is because I think the ideas that we find in McDonald, 200 years ago or so, and now these themes in contemporary literary criticism seem to be capturing this spirit, especially, I think, of the emerging generation. And so, I've seen this with younger scholars at early career stage, like I am, and with my students. I think we're looking for this kind of more generous approach to the way we do our work and how we interact with others. And I think this generation, is wanting more of that, to be more constructive and creative, not just to pull things apart, but to build something. So I think it's an incredible opportunity. I think it leaves the question of what we're building.
Right.
But I suspect that perhaps if we think about the manner in which we do it, that might affect what we end up building.
Yeah.
I think that does do something to shape, the end result if the manner in which we do things is, if we're kind of operating in that way, with that kind of generosity and attention and so forth. Anyway, so, but I think that, that relational element, how we're engaging with other people, is hugely important. And I think that's important in McDonald's work too. It's all over the place, the relationality, and the importance of the way that we kind of inhabit the world. It's not about getting it all right intellectually. It's about, how we're relating to others and, kind of being the truth, as he would say, or being truth. Yeah. But,
Thank you, Amanda. I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No.
The thought that comes to my mind is endless deconstruction leads to total destruction.
Yeah.
Right? At some point, you can only split things into pieces until there's no pieces left.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I do sense a ability, maybe because they were so immersed in it, the ability to be a bit more objective about thoughts and ideas presented with respect to the nature and personality of the presenter. It seemed as though the essence of the last decade or more was, if the presenter of the ideas had at any point in their life said anything untoward or sinister, it could be very bad, they were forever permanently banned from presenting. Yeah. So how that stunts human formation, the ability for redemption, all of the things that McDonald, the whole essence of the gospel is about, has been just completely quashed during this period, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, again, I feel like the instinct underneath that, like the desire for integrity and, a certain kind of, moral rectitude, whatever,
Sure.
moral framework we're operating in, I think I'm always like, I want to see the like the good kind of impulse there. But yeah,
Agreed.
absolutely, certainly we go overboard. And I think that is, something, yeah, I'm not sure where we are with those kinds of things. I think I see a mixture of young people having grace and also young people still being quite, there can be a lot of harshness and a lot
Right.
of critique towards those with whom they're disagreeing or who have shown themselves to be I guess problematic in some way. So I think that's something that we're still figuring out in that space, because I don't know what I don't know. I guess I would be so interested to kind of, actually, this is now making me think, oh, that would be an interesting seminar to kind of have a discussion about, like, what do we do with this? Because
Yeah,
I
bring it
think
on.
I think so, having those conversations, I'm not sure where or who is having those conversations. And I suspect, for instance, if I presented this as a topic in one of my seminars, the group that I just had, they were really engaged and really thoughtful. And I think it would precipitate some interesting conversation and some thoughtfulness, because I think part of it is just being a bit self-reflexive about what's actually
Hmm.
how we're operating. And I think that's why I'm interested in this kind of the manner in which we're doing things, because I think if you're focused on that, I think that can be helpful for kind of, okay, well, how am I responding to this person? And it's this kind of two-way vision of not just looking at something else, but also looking at myself and seeing, to be generous to somebody, you have to check yourself sometimes, right? Or to be
Right.
open to somebody, you have to kind of check yourself. So, yeah, I think that's probably what I'm trying to get at a little bit is this kind of natural self-reflection there. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm an idealist. I don't know.
Oh, well, you're in the right spot. This is the home for idealism. I say more of it. We've got plenty of cynicism, as you've pointed out.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think the challenge, Amanda, from my perspective, is our ability to perceive long-term trends. So what I mean by that is intergenerational conflicts. I'm personally persuaded by the work of Strauss and Howe. They wrote a book called Generations in the probably early 90s. I read it in college, and it definitely was influential in my thought and approach to culture in America.
Mm,
And as you were articulating your own experience with your students, this sort of post-critical
hmm
stage, I thought about how we got here. And the one that stands out to me would be, and you would be familiar having grown up in Ohio. I grew up in Kentucky, so not too far in terms
hmm
of the kind of ethos that we both experienced in our upbringing. But I thought about the outsized influence of the boomer generation, and this is not disparaging. This is simply a reflection that, first of all, they're larger number demographically, and so their actions and reactions are going to be more magnified than, I'm a Gen X, we're
mm,
smaller.
hmm
But also, it stands out to me that their primary animus with the generation before them was any hypocrisy that generation lived out. There was sort of I don't know, whether it be iconic, making icons of what happened post World War II and the American image that
hmm
didn't comport with what they saw on the
hmm
ground, whether it be civil
hmm
rights, particularly the Vietnam War. And
hmm
so for them, that was just blatant hypocrisy, and it was half measures. There would be a little amelioration of an issue, but never actual equality. And I think that led to this notion of if we spot anything that is hypocritical or doesn't line up, it must be eradicated. Does that make any sense to
mm,
you?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, it
so
does. Yeah,
yeah, when I
yeah.
think about these things, I tend to think like in 100-year blocks, like how not like
Mm,
last week or
hmm
last year, but really long sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
rolling disagreements that
Yes,
that
yes.
turbul cause turbulence for us all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think that does make sense actually. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say.
No worries. Well, George would know. George would know.
George would.
Or he would know that there's, nothing to be said at the moment. We'll just reflect and return. Um,
Mm,
such a gentle soul, but
hmm.
not in any way weak with respect to what
No,
what he thought
no.
or believed.
No, no, not at all, not at all. And I think it's so difficult too, because I think I think he's so focused on the individual, and I suspect that he would have had. I mean, I know he had a lot of people come over and sit with him and talk. He was kind of a counselor to many people, um, and yeah, I think he just took people, person by person. It seems to
Yeah,
me he of course he makes comments about cultural movements, I guess at large or whatever. But and yeah, yeah, I don't know.
yeah. Well, we'll keep moving along. Um, so I've just got a few more questions, believe it or not.
Mm.
Just delightful, Amanda. I'm so thrilled that you were willing to do this with us.
Oh,
I mean that sincerely.
oh, thank you.
Of course. I've entitled this Vocation and Transition. And again, we've
Mm,
already articulated we're in a disruptive era. But in particular, the pervasiveness of technology, the
mm,
potential arise of artificial intelligence
hmm,
tools and software that can displace and replace, human function. In
hmm,
my own experience, our son, he's now 17, but a few years back, we tested out a little pilot program that was created by employees at SpaceX for their own children. It's called Synthesis. It's gone on now to be, I think, a like a school in its own. But it was very interesting because the premise is AI moderated dynamics, but the learning occurred in a gaming format that was collaborative. So there would be 6 to 8 students come on, of course, virtually, and a teacher would give them just a brief 5-minute overview of what was happening, the topic, and then they would all have to play a new game they had never seen before that was designed to reinforce whatever it was they were
mm,
learning, and they had to figure it out together. It's a very interesting experiment.
yeah.
But I bring that up because it's a personal experience, and I'm curious as to your thoughts, if you have any, with respect to traditional vocation, the one you're occupying right now as a teacher.
Very precarious.
Right, right. Uh,
Yeah.
do you think about it at all?
Oh, yes.
So then what do you think? And then what do you think George might be able to do to, as your, third housemate, to help you reconcile and navigate it?
I'm gonna start
Because you're
speaking to
not
the image of
alone.
George on my wall.
Yeah, you're not alone. I'm retired, but I was a lawyer for 20 years, and there's plenty of functions that I would have done for clients that can probably be done by software just as well at this point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I'm laughing because I went out to lunch with some colleagues last week and we had this big conversation about AI. Um, and yeah, so we're
I'm
we're
all
all
ears.
kind of
Tell me.
well, no, I think we're all just kind of like, where is this going? AI can write well.
Yeah.
If you need it to correct a sentence or something, it does, write you an email. It does a pretty good job. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Um, it's certainly something to consider. Whether I'm going to be, whether I'm going to, there will be my sort of job will be, made redundant, is what I'm trying to say. Although I would hope, because I think, my seminars are discussion based. And so I would hope that there is something about, I mean, personally, again, I'm an idealist. So there's something about being able to engage on a personal level with your students. And yes, AI could probably ask better questions than I do at a seminar. I have no idea. But I think there's the human element elicits something. I think there is, especially when you're talking about literature. I would hope that brings something else out in a conversation, that there's a kind of more affective element
Mm,
to it than just the kind of exercise of the brain. Because I think that's, again, going back to this kind of post-critical movement, that's another strand of it, is just this, we're not able to just, analyze things without, we're embodied affective creatures, who are attached in various ways and are moved by the things that we read. And so we need to take that into account. So that's my answer to my job, to my job security. No, I don't have a particular answer to that. But I think I'm thinking about this with McDonald. I find it very interesting because the more that I study the 19th century, I don't know whether everybody who studies a particular time period does this, because I've heard of people who work on earlier periods say similar things, but I still see a lot of parallels between the 19th century and now. So I've written down a few that I'm going to read because I want you to get a sense of the, similarities here. So huge anxieties about the speed of life with industrialization, the railroad, the question of jobs being done away with because of technology, so machines taking jobs from people. That was a huge concern. Shifts in the way that people were working, so people moving to cities, working in factories, being removed from the kind of natural cycles of the seasons and the times of days and so on, and we're doing this kind of remote working and who knows what else we're doing. Worries about the environment, worries about how these changes in industrialization and ways of life were impacting the natural world, the amount of information and media that they were exposed to. So more people could read, and with technology, more material was being printed, like massive boom in the amount of material being printed. It's crazy.
Interesting.
And yeah.
Can I ask if
yeah.
do you know of any, it had been a few hundred years since the printing press. Were there any innovations in mass publication that made this a thing?
Well, I think with industrialization, that even sped up more.
Sure.
So like loads of like local newspapers, and they were able to just print at a faster rate. So, all of that kind of stuff. So
that makes sense.
They did have printing, but it got even quicker. And
it's all Gutenberg's fault.
Yeah. To go back to manuscripts, like being a monk in a tower somewhere. Yeah. And this is, I find this quite interesting. So there were a lot of worries because of this increase in information and media about what people were reading, and what impact it might have on certain groups of people, and an addiction to media. This is funny now, right? Because we're like, please just read, we're all on our phones. But people were talking about it in terms of addiction. So consumption of media, they were worried that this consumption of media offered no kind of nutrition, mental nutrition. And people were just consuming, just for the purposes of entertainment. So I think this helps to kind of get a sense of these anxiety, because they were really, there were all these things about, the anxiety created by the pace of modern life. And to me, I just look at, the headlines and articles that are, constantly being produced in a similar concern. So to some extent, I find it comforting because there's nothing new under the sun, in a way. But I also think it's kind of important to recognize that this is the backdrop that McDonald is writing against. This is the context that he's living and working in. He lived in Manchester for a while, the big industrial city. And in London, so big, loud, busy cities. He was also very politically involved with lots of social reform movements. And, so he wasn't kind of out in a field somewhere writing fairy tales. He was, in the cities and traveling on the train, going to lecture in these different cities. So he's not distancing himself from political activity or social involvement. And he's inviting people into his home. But at the same time that he's doing this, he is writing fairy tales and fantasies. So he's engaging with these kind of realities of modern life, but he's also kind of offering this alternative vision of reality, this enchanted reality, not as a form of escapism, I don't think, but as a challenge, again, to go back to this idea of the commonplace, a kind of challenge to these conventional ways of thinking, to kind of an unthinking assent to how we're operating now. And he saw society becoming increasingly materialistic, both in the sense of, maybe diminishing spiritual life in some ways, but also in terms of money, of commodities. He was kind of scathing in his critique of fashionable, wealthy people who were at these fashionable churches and who weren't actually practicing, generosity or charity or whatever. So I think we can kind of take a lesson from him in a way,
Yeah.
that we can be engaged in these conversations, but at the same time recognize that there's this other reality that, is accessible by way of imagination. And so he writes. I wrote down this quote because I thought it was appropriate. This is from his essay on the imagination, its function, and its cultures, and he writes, "It is not the things we see the most clearly that influence us the most powerfully. Undefined yet vivid visions of something beyond, something which eye has not seen nor ear heard, have far more influence than any logical sequences whereby the same things may be demonstrated to the intellect." I love that. I love that because it's so true. It's so
Yes.
true, and it's interesting because I was teaching McDonald last semester, which was so fun because I haven't really properly got to do that. And I saw my students, most of them, I think all of them probably had not encountered McDonald before, and they responded to this particular thing in a very nice way. So there was a kind of a real response to the kind of idea of an enchanted world. So one of my students was really amazed because she said, "Oh, he actually writes what he wants to do, and then he does it. Like, it works. Like, you're kind of invited into this story, and it's really uplifting, and it's really nice. It's really lovely to be kind of reading this in this space." And of course I was delighted by this, but I was so struck by that because I didn't give them, I was trying to be as neutral as possible. I wasn't like, "I'll give you extra credit if you like McDonald." But that was her experience of reading this. And I think, the fact that he was dealing with some of the same issues, of course, in different ways, but some of the same issues that we seem to be dealing with. And then I have students coming in, in their 20s, early 20s or something like that, who are reading this, and they're having a similar experience, it seems, of what McDonald wanted them to have here, 200 years later. So I think there's still a relevance there, and still a need for that kind of, I think, vision.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm reminded, thank you for reading from his essay as well. That reminds me of Chesterton's line that Dr. MacDonald returns to fairyland like someone coming home.
Yes, a citizen.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
It's so, as you say, not an escapist. It's actually a revealing of the deeper, the more real, the actual underlying this whole phenomenon called being a human.
Yeah. I put up because we were reading Adela Cathcart with fairy tales and all, and we were talking about we talked about escape and truth and fact and all this kind of stuff, and which was just really fun. And there's a quotation from The Shadows, one of the stories in Adela Cathcart, where Ralph Rinkelmann, the man who goes to fairyland, talks about how all true art makes you, when you go back to kind of ordinary life, it reveals the wonderful, that's in ordinary life. And I put that quotation up and I just said, "What do you think?" And this one student in particular, she was like, it's just wonderful. He's just so great." And I was like, yes, he is. But it's obviously really resonating with her, this idea of, and not just her, the other students as well, this idea of this kind of transformed perception of the ordinary and reality. And, I think there's something in us that, that is looking for that. So anyway,
That's so good. And I guess I will ask you then on that, how would you counsel today's college students seeking the meaning and purpose? I think the answer is kind of self-revelatory at this point, but could you maybe articulate it with respect to George MacDonald?
Yeah. I think part of it is space and time. I think I think that's like kind of on a practical level. I think I think they, and me, I'm talking to myself as well, just to kind of listen, like space and time to listen what's going on inside of themselves, but also, if they're a person of faith, what God might be saying. And, that's really hard. I think that's a practice that, you have to do. But I think having that kind of ability to cultivate that kind of internal and external space helps, I think, to then be able to look at things and see them differently, because you've just quieted down all that, kind of all that noise, and you're not just reacting to the next thing. And I think it's related to the idea of attention, which I think is related to the idea of vision and how you look at the world and what you're paying attention to. Because, if you're mindful of if you're mindful of what you're paying attention to, I really think that shapes so much of who you are. And if you're letting an algorithm dictate what you're giving your attention to, you can do that, or you can kind of take a bit more ownership over who and what you want to be. And so, yeah. So I think space and time, and there's this, okay, I'm going to read you another quote because I love this one. This is like a soundbite, a McDonald soundbite from his novel, Wilfred Cumbermead. So his narrator, Wilfred Cumbermead, says, "Certainly work is not always required of a man. There is such a thing as a sacred idleness, the cultivation of which is now fearfully neglected." And I love this because I am a classic overworker. So it's a really great reminder that, sacred idleness. And he goes on after this to kind of offer a full-on, this is not an oblique unsaying, this is like a full-on critique of contemporary thought. So he says that if people in the 19th century saw Abraham seated in his tent door in the heat of the day, he would be an object for uplifted hands and pointed fingers, and they would call him an indolent Arab. And I think this is such a relevant example for so many reasons, right? We have this critique here of a stereotype about somebody who's different, who's culturally different, who's probably racially different than most of McDonald's readers. And then rather than going along with that, unhelpful and rather ignorant stereotype, he challenges it and he points out that actually this is where God showed up when it comes to Abraham. Yeah. And I think it's relevant today on a number of levels. We can kind of connect the dots. But this kind of, idea, I love this idea of cultivating a sacred idleness, to kind of, slow down and, set ourselves up well to ask maybe those big questions or to hear something about those big questions about meaning and purpose, about why we're here and so on. So I think kind of creating that space for ourselves, go sit and listen to the birds for 15 minutes a day or something,
Yeah, that's great.
So I don't know. That to me is because I think that those are the moments, like speaking personally, I think that's where I've been able to reflect on what I think my meaning and purpose is. And it's like coming back to myself in a way. And that's hard. And I think it's particularly hard. I didn't, grow up with a smartphone in the way that young people have now, people in their 20s. And so I have trouble enough, putting it away. So I can imagine it's even harder. So I think that, as simple as it is, and yet so challenging. But
Oh, thank you so much, Amanda. Okay, final question. Well, two, but maybe if there's anything else you'd like to say on why George MacDonald is so important, and then I'd love to know what the best story you've ever read is.
Oh, that's a mean question. Let me think about why else George MacDonald. Oh, I don't know. I think I've said, most of my kind of favorite things about George MacDonald. I think I would just say go give him a shot if you haven't read him, because you'll probably find something that you appreciate. I was really very struck by my students' response to him. I was curious how they were going to respond, and they were really positive. So it kind of gives me
Good.
hope that he's still speaking to other people as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
But in terms of the best story, so I think the best story is like I would say it's a kind of story. So,
Okay.
which is the fairy tale. And I use that in a very broad sense. So personally, I'm all about fairies and goblins and stuff like that. But what I'm talking about is more in line with what Tolkien talks about in his essay on fairy stories. So he talks about stories with a good catastrophe, eucatastrophe, this kind of sudden joyous turn, this miraculous grace. And he writes, it doesn't deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is an evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. So that kind of story doesn't have to be a fantasy or fairy tale, although I think there's something about those genres that kind of allows for it. And there's this other writer that I love called Frederick Buechner, and he has this
Hmm.
book called Telling the Truth. The Gospel is Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. And Buechner was a big fan of McDonald's. And in many ways, and especially the last section of the book, which is about the gospel is fairy tale, his ideas really resonate with McDonald's thinking and Tolkien. He quotes that section that I just read in the book. And the thing that I love about the Buechner chapter is that he kind of draws our attention to how the grace of that unexpected turn, that Eucatastrophe, is present in our ordinary lives. And fairy tales and the feeling that we have when we read them, this kind of longing for ultimate consolation, the desire to be at home, the desire for magic. These are kind of revelatory of a deeper truth. And I think if you're not really into, fairy tales, then maybe the most beautiful piece of music that you've heard, or the most beautiful painting, that it captures something similar, I think. And personally, that's how I read John 20. It's like my fairy tale hermeneutic. So when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb a few
Oh,
days after
yes.
Christ's crucifixion, and she's heartbroken and she's crying and she thinks all of this is over, and the gardener appears, and he's the prince in disguise,
Yeah.
it's or the friend in disguise. He's the one that she was longing for and grieving, and it turns out that he's alive. So I think that's my answer to the best story I've read. Is it's a story
Wow.
that comes in many different forms.
Mm.
From Mary Magdalene meeting Jesus to fairy tales to McDonald.
Yeah.
It's all
Yeah.
over McDonald too. So
Oh, John 20. Thank you, Amanda. So
mm,
I'm gonna indulge myself for a second.
great.
Uh, 20-ish years ago, I happened by serendipity to be with a friend who our trek to Washington, D.C. was halted by the sudden and tragic death of one of his friends.
Mm,
And we attended the memorial service, and on the Sunday before the man passed away, he was a worship leader, and he shared in the midst of their worship time a reflection on John chapter 20. And they played that recording at the memorial service, and it has just lit me up ever since.
mm,
And I'll share it with you now if you've never encountered this thought before. But he pointed out in particular, when Mary realized it was Jesus, she ran to hug him, and he says, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." And the reflection that was shared during this memorial service was how much Jesus loved her, that imagine he had just harrowed hell, had defeated death, hell, and the grave, and was returning, but stopped. Imagine all the angels who had been celebrating and rejoicing when he was born in the field to the shepherds. Now the same heavenly host are rejoicing, perhaps even more so if possible, at his impending return. And he tells them, just a second, Mary's distraught, and I want to make sure she knows everything's okay. I
mm.
just that's if that's not a love story, there isn't such a
Yeah,
thing, right?
yeah, absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. That's
thank
beautiful.
you for
Thank
bringing that
you.
up. Any final thoughts? And be sure to tell us what your new book's about.
Oh yes. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a little while before it comes out, but yeah. So I'm writing a book on what am I writing a book on? I'm writing a book on McDonald, and his how his theology of the Trinity kind of impacts his ideas about literature and reading, literary form in particular. So I'm excited. I'm excited about it. It's a labor of love.
Aren't they all?
Yeah, 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 exactly, exactly. Me too. Yeah,
Awesome.
but
Well, and if people want to know more about you, or perhaps want to have you speak, you have your website is probably the easiest way
yes,
to
yeah,
get in touch.
yeah. I think that's the easiest. Yeah, it's amandabvernon.com. Make sure you put the B in because there's another Amanda Vernon out there. So, um, yeah, and you
The
can
B
find
stands for
yeah.
best.
I like that. I like that. Factually inaccurate, but perhaps truthful. No,
We're
no, I couldn't claim
idealists.
that.
We're
So
idealists.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. This has been so much fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word vicissitude. 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 It's a change of circumstances or fortune, typically one that is unwelcome or unpleasant. You know, as I reflect on the conversation that I had with Amanda, and I reflect on all the disruption that's happened in our society over the last couple of decades, as well as look at, as she mentioned, the disruption that George McDonald's culture faced with the Industrial Revolution, I think about how vicissitudes are so prevalent in our lives. It must have deeper meaning, don't you think? Like vicissitudes have been impacting and influencing and affecting the journey of a person through life forever. I imagine way back, as far back as you can, there were vicissitudes of weather and predators. And as we continue to progress in life, there will always be vicissitudes. You can't control the vicissitudes, but you can do your darndest. That's a Kentuckian for do your best. Do your darndest to respond to vicissitudes with hope, with courage, and with determination. So, I don't often allow a word that has a negative connotation to be the sponsoring word for The Plunge, but when vicissitude reached out, I thought, you know what? That's a good word for what we've all experienced and will continue to experience. So as long as there are vicissitudes, waves that crash upon us unexpectedly, The Plunge will be here, helping you swim deeper, avoiding the storm on the surface, and finding that tranquil peace deep below. Thank you, Vicissitudes, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.